Now, welcome to the second video of my best of the year trilogy, and I mean the last year because I am delayed as often. This is the poetry edition, probably the most neglected yet the best form of human writing, at least when it comes to literature. I'm not here to neglect it. I'm actually going to talk about poetry. I'm going to make it a point to make a top best poetry of every year for as long as I do this YouTube thing. And I have a top 10, but I'm excluding one book, and that is the Iliad by Homer. I'm excluding this because I didn't read the whole thing today, I mean this year. I probably say that because I was reading today as well from it, but I picked up from where I DNF'd it last time, and that was in 2021 or 2022, I'm not sure. I was doing the Trans-Slovenian hike through the Kamnik Alps and then the Julian Alps, and it was all really nice and well until I got bitten by a tick and I got sick, but not of the typical, I think it's the Lyme disease that they could call it, some other disease that nobody knew how to treat. Nobody knew what was happening to me and some people thought I was gonna die. I mean, like, one of my doctors said that, like, it might be some sort of like immunodeficiency disease, and that if my melanin or something else values kept going down, I could be dying. Like, I don't want to scare you, but you might die, kind of thing. I mean, I'm alive, so it's not a drama anymore. But obviously, I was reading this, and at that point, I stopped reading it. Actually, not because I was dying. It's okay to read on the deathbed, but because one of the antibiotics that they were giving me, which was a very interesting one, because turns out that I could only take it standing, and like as part of the indication of the antibiotic, and then I had to be standing for at least 1 hour before I lay down, because otherwise my throat would burn or something like that. The point is that one of the secondary effects of that antibiotic was that I couldn't see almost at all, which for me is a big drama, because sight is my main sense. It's my number one sense. Like, I see 10 times better than most people. And I felt super alienated, and I obviously couldn't read. I couldn't even recognize people's faces. I don't know if I said that already. And yeah, that's also the summer where I picked up surfing, actually, because I became a surf instructor in 1 month, because at some point, after going from hospital to hospital, nobody really giving me any solution and just giving me antibiotics because they had to give me something, I decided to not continue that path, and I just left and started surfing. And I was like, okay, whenever I die, I die. It will catch me in the water at least. And I mean, I'm fine. Eventually, I think my system did what it needed to do. Nobody ever actually discovered what it was, but they were happy to hear that I survived. When I called my doctor, which by then, like, they had forgotten about me because I was from many hospitals, so nobody saw the whole process. I was in Slovenia, then I had to go to Italy, then because I wasn't in my country, and I had to go to my country because I didn't have a European sanity card or a healthcare card or whatever. So I was paying way too much money. I have to fly to Spain, but then in Spain I had nowhere to be because I don't yet own a place. So I went to Canary Islands, to where my sister was in that moment, and a whole thing. So yeah, I was the only witness to the whole process of the decadence and resurrection that I went through that summer. And it was a resurrection in many ways. I will never forget that summer. It was amazing. And this book is very tightly linked to all of those memories, and also to my incapacity to get through it. It was really, really hard. I don't know how good the translation it is. I would like. I mean, I don't know if I will ever learn Greek. I'm more inclined to learn languages that are richer in terms of their poetry. But in Greek, I only really know Homer's poetry as a reason to learn the language as a whole. And with philosophy, I don't believe that language is important at all to do philosophy. I think that philosophy can be done in any language, and any translation can be as good or even better, in the case of Kant, than its original language. So yeah, like the Iliad, it's excluded because I didn't read the whole thing this year. Now this could also be excluded, but I'm not excluding it because it did leave a mark, and I think the phone is falling forward, which is outrageous. How can I do this? I don't have a tripod. I don't know where I put my tripod. I wanted to approach Ovid, and I was like, I like Tejiu's poetry, so let's see what he does with Ovid. But then very quickly, before finishing that book, I actually turned to this one, and I did read this one, which is a simplified Latin text of the Metamorphoses, simplified because this is for high school students, and it is bilingual in a page and page, so it's actually very thin, the actual story. And I did this because I actually did this before even deciding to actually learn Latin, because I turned to be very good at understanding Latin by extrapolation and deduction. I speak quite a few Latin languages, like Latin languages, so Romance languages, and I cannot say that like I connected with Ovid, because this doesn't represent the Metamorphoses, but I am approaching the Metamorphoses slowly. The Ars Amatoria was part of my readings this year. Actually, I don't know why it's not here. I read right after what is the number. I don't know what number it is. Did I not put it here? Yeah, number 3 on the list. So yeah. Definitely, I probably recommend the original, but since I haven't read it, all I can say is, yeah, sure, read the Hughes, read Ovid, and also learn Latin. That being said, the next is... I'm excluding this because I don't put anthologies, because I read too many anthologies, and anthologies of multiple writers, and I feel like it's a little bit of cheating, like no single poet can compete against the Penguin Book of American Verse or whatever. So I'm not putting anthologies, but I wanted to give a shout out to all the anthologies I read through this one, which I wasn't expecting much from it, because it's the lady poets. I tend to run away from anthologies based on like nationality, not so much, because nationality can have an impact in terms of like the commentary of what's being talked about or anything like that. But gender, normally when it's gender or race, like read these 10 black authors or these 10 female authors. I'm always like, I feel like the book is doing the opposite of what it's trying to do. Like in a sense, it feels to me like it's sexist in a way to choose to read an author because of her gender. But it was really good. So yeah, I don't know if you have access to this, but I did like it. It's very short, so it was very, not something I expected to actually be underlining and transcribing into my notebook, but I did. Robert Graves. I will make a Robert Graves video at some point this year whenever I finish reading I, Claudius. But yeah, I love his symbolism, and I like Robert Graves in general. This is also a reread, but at least I read the whole thing this year. But I'm actually not holding this book because of the leyendas. I'm holding this because I'm thinking of Becker as a whole. Gustave Adolphe Becker was a poet that I was quite obsessed with when I was a kid. I memorized many of his poems, and it's actually a good example of why I think that poetry cannot be translated. To not go to stay within a familiar conversation, like translate. There are certain books that like you can translate from Spanish to English, but like Spanish is verb based, and verbs in English are not irrelevant, but they don't have the role that they have in Spanish at all. Like I'm thinking a poem like quiero querer a quien no queriendo quiero, he querido sin querer porque he querido sin querer y estoy sin querer queriendo, soy porque te quiero tanto, quieres que te quiera más, te quiero más que tú me quieres, que más quieres, quieres más, te quiero. Just with the word love, just conjugating in different ways, he manages not only to create meaning and alliteration, but like a whole poem that makes sense in a way that it could not happen in English or in most languages that are not Romance languages, at least. So I don't know what to do with making videos about poems or poets that I like that are not written in English on this channel, because I don't believe it's possible I don't believe that you will ever understand a poet if you don't read him in the original, with very few exceptions. And normally those exceptions are because either the translator was a poet himself, and he managed to make something that, while not being exactly the original, the ways in which it was different was still great, but it's a different thing already, or because the language was very similar, or because perhaps the poet was not so good at being a poet as at being a writer, and he had a lot to say, and although his poetry was simpler than it could have been, and not so, it didn't utilize language as much, making it more accessible for translation, the things that were being said were universal and deserved translating and reading. But when somebody is actually bending language in the way a poet can and should, it's very, very hard to take that into a different tongue. But I would love to know what you think about that, actually. So please let me know, or make a video or something. The next one is Catullus, Complete Poetry. This is also bilingual text. This is one of those books I chose for my to carry with me on my Latin learning journey, which is going to be very slow because I'm learning many other things that have nothing to do with books, and many other that have to do with books that are a priority to learning Latin at the moment, including learning other languages, which I haven't chosen yet. If I'm gonna either perfect my French or learn German, but I have to do one of the two, I think. I mean, it makes sense. But Catullus, yeah. Actually, in the introduction, the guy, this introduction is insane. I think it's only for the Spanish edition, but who wrote the introduction? Well, I don't know who wrote the introduction, but it was one of the best introductions I've ever read from anybody. So I think I'm just gonna make you wait for a second and try to find out who did. Or maybe Rodrigo Irigoyen. Ramon Irigoyen. The name seems familiar to me. Well, the introduction was incredible. If you are able to read in Spanish or something, like, this guy knew Cthulhu better than anybody that I know. I wasn't able to understand his poetry without the translation, but the translation was good. I have to say, it seemed a little bit, I don't know if archaic is the word, but like, I didn't love the poetry so much. I feel like it happens to me a lot with ancient poets, not with all of them, as you will see further ahead, but with a lot of older poets, that like, I feel like the reason why they are so loved as poets is because the moment where they wrote and the influences they created, rather than for the poems themselves. Many of the poems here seem very simple, or they were just extras, like Sappho, or if they were not extras, like, some of them were very short and fun to read, but poetically speaking, I mean, not great, in my opinion. I mean, like, if you have a strong opinion about this, please speak in the comments and we can argue. I'm not gonna, spend now an hour explaining why. But I found it very funny, though. I especially I enjoyed. He has some poems that are like more emotional, about the death of his brother, I think, or others that are like more erudite, or just like reflecting more in general. But a lot of these poems are just like incredibly scatologic or offensive, for the people that he refers to. Like, I didn't expect them to be so vulgar in a good way. I think that our reticence to accept vulgarity as part of literature is not only reactionary, but is actually to the detriment of the full extent to which literature could be utilized. So I like it, and I like Cthulhu. Catullus, I think you call him in English. Seamus Heaney, I didn't choose to read specifically 1988 to 2013. It's just the volume I came across. I knew Seamus Heaney because of Steve Donoghue, and through this edition I also learned about Horace, which is also on this list. I read a poem here aloud. I don't remember in which page it might be. Lupin's... No. But this is also a good poem. Yeah, there's a lot of poems here that I really loved. But I at some point I like to get like a complete Seamus Heaney, or like a selected Seamus Heaney if he has written too much. But I really liked it. It's one of my favorite English language poets at the moment. Elsa Lopez. Okay, this is from my island. I was in La Palma, the westernmost island in the Canary Islands, And over there, I met this old friend of mine, Elsa Lopez. She's like, I'd say the most important writer of poetry in the Canary Islands, and she has like a long bibliography. Yeah, like she's written a lot of books, especially of poetry. And I have to say that when I was in the Canary Islands like 7 years ago and I read her poetry, you know, I was like a teenager on the last legs of my first big writer cycle, you know, like finishing my teenage years as a writer, and before that long bow of silence that I did take for 5 years. And I was quite like maybe too self-confident about my own writing and everything, and I read hers and I was like, I can do that. And rereading, I realized that, you know, there's so much more in this poetry than I saw then, just probably because of my age, and because of my lack of experience and everything. And going back to some of her poetry now, I really love some of these poems. Some of them because they were just amazing. Especially there is one that she wrote, I think, in this edition, Inevitable Océano, about like her father's dementia, that I found incredible. Like just, you know, an incredible imaginary that she creates with like she's talking about the ocean and jellyfishes and like anything but that, and somehow when you hear that what she was actually talking was about her father's dementia and his memory loss, it makes so much sense. Like suddenly, like the whole narrative and all the surrealism becomes so naturalist, so actually not surreal, in a very potent way. And then in this, which was her first poetry book published, she made a series of poems about La Palma, that island, which is my favorite. I don't know if my favorite place in the world, but one of the very few places I call home. I could ever call home, and that is one of my favorite poems of all time because it's so it hits close to home, valga la redundancia, as we say in Spanish, but it's also a really good poem, and in general, I have to give her the number 5 position, and I don't read a lot of poetry that I don't read cover to cover. That's like there's other books here that maybe could be higher up if I had read them cover to cover. I don't see the same value in reading cover to cover a whole book when it comes to poetry as with other forms of writing. That's why I had to exclude some other books. But either way, I think she would still be on the top 10. I really liked it. Okay, now maybe another sort of like relatively subjective, relatively personal choice, and that is El Ego, La Otredad, de Daniel Rodríguez Rodero, DRR. This is a guy, I think 2 years older than me, and I came across this because one of these sort of like academic literature guys from YouTube made a video about one of his poems, and I watched it. I'm extremely skeptic about poetry written by anybody alive that is around my age, because it tends to be shit. And I say that like with a lot of knowledge, of course, because I was big on those sort of like collective circles of young people making poets today, and they all sucked. Back then when I was doing it, they all sucked. There was not one good poet, or like there was one of every 10, and even that one was very misled about what even poetry was. Like it's incredible how much lack of even knowing like the most basic things about poetry there was in those circles. So whenever I hear that somebody under the age of 40 is writing and publishing poems, I generally, with very, very, very few counted exceptions, I am very skeptic about their poetry. And it took me one poem to see that this is not only a good poet of my generation, but this is a poet that like I will for the rest of his writing career be reading, and that if I was more insecure, I would feel competitive toward the DRR, because I believe myself to be a great poet of my generation, and there tends to be that rivalry, the whole Quevedo Góngora kind of thing in among poets. But since I am not, I'm actually excited for anything that he writes, and it makes me very happy to know that there is people who writes poetry that good. I believe that what he's written here is one of the best poetry books that has been written on the 21st century. And it's this short, but I'm not gonna say every poem, because I did see there was a couple of poems that were a little bit simpler and lazier, and perhaps even had a verse that could be removed. But this is almost a perfect collection of poetry, and some of the poems here are sublime. They are Quevedesque. They are like completely inspired by the golden era of poetry, the Spanish Baroque. It reminds me of the other book I was talking about before, that I said felt like an instant classic. I mean, in the other video from Amor Towers, because he was a good writer, nothing to do with him at all. But just that sense of like being reading something that it's a classic already as you're reading it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this became, if I had to make a best poetry books of 2020 of the 21st century, this would definitely be there. El ego a la otra edad, de Daniel Rodríguez Rodero. I don't know if it's still in print. I don't know how successful he was with this book, but I hope he was very successful, because I would love to read more of his stuff. And it makes me very happy and very hopeful about my generation in terms of writers. Okay, what do we have now? Yeah, the Odes of Horace. Okay, this I was reading in PDS mainly. While I was coursing Italy, I started reading Horace because it was the moment when I decided I wanted to learn Latin, after having crossed Tuscany on a bicycle, and seeing, like being on the Sixtine Chapel and Rome and in Florence, and just falling in love with that whole world. And I read all Horace, but I think the Odes were definitely what stood out the most, and it felt so close and so honest and so, I don't know, I just loved every poem. I love Horace. I wasn't expecting to love him as much, but to me, it probably because when I was doing it and the way I was doing it, so immersed into that moment of my year, I couldn't put him anywhere else other than the number 3 position. And then on number 2 we have Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I was reading her. I'm gonna run out of memory, so I'm gonna have to hurry up. Okay, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I was reading her throughout the whole year. I found her when I started sort of like researching on Spanish poets, because I've been, as you can probably see by the themes here and everything, trying to reconnect with my with literature and poetry specifically made on my language, as part of a project that I had, which I did complete, of like writing a long poem, and she was she was like a key figure throughout my whole year. And not only that, but like the main character of my novel, the one that I am writing, I gave her name, not only Juana but Sor Juana, because it's also a nun, the main character of my novel, at least for the first couple of chapters. So yes, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, one of the best poets that have ever been in Spanish language, and perhaps one of the very few people who could beat her is San Juan de la Cruz, another Christian poet. San Juan de la Cruz is probably the most sublime writer of poetry that has ever been, or it's like, I think it would be on a top 10 on, even if it was worldwide, global, and multi-language, he will still be there on the top 10. It's amazing, it's incredible. I can't think of very few poets within the Spanish language that could even sit at the same table. I have this book from him here with it's a little bit biographical, it's a little bit of everything. It's not complete. I want to get a nice complete book and truly study that this man, because it was just insane. I have already committed to heart a few of his poems, and I will continue to do so. I have excluded my 2 favorite poetry books of the year from this list, because the 2 favorite have become 2 of my favorite books of all time, and that is the Rerum Natura from Lucretius and the Divine Comedy, which I read in prose with really shitty notes and really bad, and then on this, which is this is the edition in the book in which I first came across of it in my grandmother's house years and years ago, but of course I didn't read it then because I was way too young, and I was just interested on the illustrations. But I will talk about Rerum Natura and the Divine Comedy on a different video whenever I talk about my favorite books of all time. As of now, number 1, San Juan de la Cruz. Number 2, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Many crosses there. And number 3, the Oaths of Horace. I hope I was able to show you anything new, and if I didn't, well, then you're very well read, and continue to be so. There's only one top left, and that is the best philosophy books that I have read. And for that, the pile will be a little bit bigger, and the video will also be longer, which means I will have to fix my memory, because I have a lot more to say about philosophy as always. And yeah, that's all. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the other side, and that's all. Yes, one more thing. What was it? Yes. Can you believe I just forgot? This is an interesting ending. If you got here, do let me know in the comments that you got to see me stutter mentally. And as I said before, I'll see you on the other side. Thank you, Victor.